Some doors are locked to protect secrets, but the most dangerous ones are the doors that open by mistake. 30 seconds. That was all it took for Adrian Moretti to question everything he believed about the quiet woman who had worked inside his mansion for nearly 2 years. Rain pressed softly against the tall windows as evening settled over the sprawling estate on the outskirts of New York. The marble hallways reflected the warm glow of antique chandeliers, and the faint scent of cedar would drifted through the silent house, where every clock seemed to tick with deliberate precision. Adrian rarely returned home before midnight, but a canceled meeting had brought him back hours earlier than anyone expected. His tailored charcoal suit still carried the chill of the November air as he climbed the grand staircase with measured steps, absently reviewing tomorrow's schedule in his mind. The mansion was unusually quiet. Most of the staff had already finished their duties, and only the distant hum of the heating system disturbed the silence. Grace Coleman had just completed cleaning the East Wing and quietly entered the small private room reserved for household staff. She locked the main door as she always did before changing out of her work uniform, believing the hallway outside was empty. At the same moment Adrian reached the second floor, he noticed that the study door across the corridor had been left slightly open. Without thinking, he reached for what he believed was the study entrance. Instead, he turned the wrong brass handle. The door opened only a few inches before both of them froze. Grace immediately stepped behind a nearby folding screen, startled by the unexpected interruption. Adrian looked away almost instantly. "I am sorry," he said firmly, his voice carrying genuine embarrassment rather than authority. "I opened the wrong door." He began pulling the door closed, but before it shut completely, his eyes caught something resting on a small wooden table beside the window. It was not what anyone would expect to notice in such an awkward moment. A weathered military medal lay beside several neatly folded letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon. Next to them rested an old family photograph showing a smiling young girl standing between an older woman in a nurse's uniform and a teenage boy wearing a graduation gown. One corner of the picture had been carefully repaired with transparent tape after years of being folded and unfolded. Adrian stood motionless for only a heartbeat before quietly closing the door without another word. He remained in the hallway longer than he intended, staring at the polished oak floor while questions gathered faster than answers. Grace had never mentioned a family. She had never spoken about medals, handwritten letters, or the carefully preserved photograph she guarded with such care. Downstairs, the house manager greeted Adrian with the usual evening report, but Adrian barely listened. His thoughts remained fixed on the small wooden table hidden inside that modest room. Hours later, after the mansion had settled into complete silence, he found himself standing outside the same hallway again. He did not knock. He did not open the door. Instead, he noticed something he had somehow overlooked before. Beneath the handle hung a tiny silver cross no larger than a coin, worn smooth by years of careful touch. It was the kind of object someone carried not because it was valuable, but because losing it would feel like losing a part of themselves. Adrian quietly walked away, unaware that the brief accidental glance through the wrong doorway had revealed only the smallest piece of a life far more extraordinary than anyone inside the mansion had ever imagined. 3 weeks earlier, before a single unanswered question had taken root inside Adrian's mind, Grace Coleman was simply another quiet face moving through the endless rhythm of the Moretti estate. Every morning began before sunrise. She arrived through the service entrance carrying a modest canvas bag that had been carefully mended along one corner, greeted the kitchen staff with a warm smile, and immediately disappeared into her routine before most of the mansion had fully awakened. The estate stretched across nearly 12 acres of rolling hills, surrounded by ancient oak trees whose branches swayed gently above winding stone paths. Inside, polished marble floors reflected the golden light pouring through towering windows, while priceless paintings lined the walls with silent elegance. Yet Grace rarely paused long enough to admire any of it. Her attention remained fixed on ordinary details that few people ever noticed. Fresh flowers received clean water every morning. Family photographs were dusted with remarkable care. Books were returned to their exact places on library shelves. Even the antique grandfather clock in the west hallway always gleamed because Grace quietly polished its brass pendulum every Friday afternoon without being asked. Most employees appreciated her reliability, but very few truly knew her. During lunch breaks, she often chose a small wooden bench overlooking the greenhouse instead of joining the others in the staff dining room. She answered questions politely, laughed softly when someone shared a funny story, and never complained about long hours or difficult assignments. When conversations drifted toward personal lives, however, Grace always redirected them with gentle kindness until the attention moved elsewhere. It became an unspoken understanding throughout the mansion that she valued privacy more than sympathy. Adrian noticed her only in passing. Their interactions rarely lasted longer than a few seconds. She greeted him respectfully each morning, and he responded with the same brief nod before continuing toward another meeting or another phone call. To him, she appeared disciplined, dependable, and almost invisible within the carefully ordered machinery of the household. Yet small moments gradually unsettled that simple impression. One afternoon he passed the grand piano in the music room and found Grace quietly adjusting fresh lilies in a crystal vase. Before she realized anyone was nearby, her fingers drifted across 3 piano keys with remarkable confidence, producing a gentle melody that lingered in the air for only a moment before she stepped back and resumed her work as though nothing had happened. Another evening, Adrian noticed a stack of library books resting beside the fireplace after everyone else had gone home. The titles covered nursing, history, finance, and classical literature, each marked with neatly folded paper instead of bookmarks. The librarian quietly mentioned that Grace borrowed books almost every week and always returned them exactly on time. The observation surprised Adrian more than he cared to admit. None of it matched the assumptions he had unconsciously formed about the quiet woman who cleaned hallways and organized guest rooms with unwavering precision. Then there were the phone calls. Almost every night, just before leaving the estate, Grace stepped outside onto the rear garden terrace for exactly 10 minutes. She never lingered longer. She never missed a single evening. She spoke so softly that no words carried through the cool autumn air, yet every conversation ended with the same gentle smile before she slipped the phone back into her bag and walked toward the bus stop beneath the dim glow of the streetlights. Adrian noticed the pattern only because his office overlooked the gardens, and after several weeks, he found himself wondering why someone who guarded every part of her own story so carefully still smiled with such quiet hope at the end of every single call. The evening after Adrian accidentally noticed the small wooden table inside Grace's room, sleep refused to come easily. Long after the mansion had fallen silent, he remained alone inside his library, watching the fireplace cast slow shadows across shelves lined with leather-bound books collected over decades. Rain continued tapping gently against the tall windows, and every now and then the old grandfather clock echoed another passing hour. His thoughts should have been occupied by contracts, investments, or tomorrow's meetings, yet they kept returning to a faded blue ribbon, an old family photograph, and the military medal resting beside carefully folded letters. None of those belongings matched the simple life he believed Grace lived. The following morning arrived wrapped in pale gray clouds. As Adrian crossed the main foyer, he noticed Grace arranging fresh white roses inside a crystal vase beneath the sweeping staircase. She worked with the same quiet precision as always, replacing each stem one at a time until the arrangement appeared effortless. When she sensed his footsteps approaching, she stepped aside respectfully and offered her usual gentle smile. "Good morning, Mr. Moretti." Adrian returned the greeting, but this time he hesitated before walking away. "Those flowers always seem to last longer when you arrange them," he said. Grace smiled politely. "My mother taught me that every flower needs room to breathe." The answer was simple, yet something about the way she spoke made it feel like she was describing people rather than roses. Before Adrian could ask another question, Grace quietly excused herself and continued toward the east hallway with her cleaning cart. Throughout the day, he found himself noticing details he had overlooked for months. Grace greeted every employee by name, from the groundskeeper trimming hedges outside to the elderly cook preparing breakfast before dawn. She remembered birthdays without checking calendars. She quietly left homemade soup outside the maintenance supervisor's office after learning he had been recovering from the flu. When one of the younger housekeepers accidentally dropped an expensive porcelain plate, Grace calmly helped gather the broken pieces before anyone else arrived, offering reassurance instead of criticism. None of those moments drew attention. They simply disappeared into the ordinary rhythm of the estate, as though kindness had become another invisible household duty. Late that afternoon, Adrian stopped by the administrative office to review payroll reports. While signing routine documents, he casually asked the house manager how long Grace had worked there. "Almost 2 years," the manager replied. "Never late. Never absent without reason. She volunteers for extra shifts whenever someone else has a family emergency." Adrian looked down at the employment file resting on the desk. The application contained only the information required for hiring. No references to the medal. No explanation for the letters. No mention of the photograph. One line quietly caught his attention. Emergency contact, Ethan Coleman. Relationship, younger brother. Adrian closed the folder thoughtfully. That evening, as the last employees prepared to leave, he glanced through his office window overlooking the rear gardens. Right on schedule, Grace stepped onto the stone terrace with her phone. A gentle smile brightened her face as she listened more than she spoke. Then, after ending the call, she reached into her canvas bag and removed a folded piece of paper. She read it carefully beneath the warm garden lights before pressing it gently against her heart for only a moment. She folded it again with extraordinary care, slipped it back inside the bag, and quietly walked toward the front gate. Adrian watched until she disappeared beyond the iron entrance, unaware that the ordinary-looking letter she treasured each evening carried a truth capable of changing everything he believed about the quiet woman who had spent 2 years walking unnoticed through his home. The next afternoon, the mansion felt unusually peaceful beneath a clear autumn sky. Sunlight spilled through the towering windows, stretching long ribbons of light across polished marble floors, while the faint scent of freshly baked bread drifted from the kitchen. Adrian found himself walking more slowly than usual, no longer rushing from meeting to meeting inside his own home. Questions had quietly replaced assumptions, and every ordinary detail surrounding Grace now seemed to hold hidden meaning. Later that evening, after most of the staff had finished their work, the house manager entered Adrian's office carrying several routine documents that required signatures before the end of the month. Among invoices and maintenance reports rested a small envelope that had been delivered to the estate earlier that afternoon. It had been addressed to Grace Coleman, but mistakenly placed with executive correspondence because of the family name printed beneath the mansion address. Adrian immediately recognized the handwriting from the folded letter he had seen Grace reading in the garden. Without opening it, he turned the envelope over in his hands. The paper was inexpensive, carefully sealed, and slightly worn from traveling through the mail. In the upper left corner appeared the return address of a public university nearly 300 miles away. Adrian quietly asked the house manager whether Grace had mentioned attending college. The manager smiled gently and shook his head. "No, sir. She never speaks much about herself." Adrian handed the envelope back without another question. "Please make sure she receives it tonight." As the manager left, curiosity lingered in the room long after the door closed. A few hours later, Adrian crossed the first floor on his way toward the library. Passing the open kitchen, he noticed Grace sitting alone at the small employee table during her dinner break. The envelope rested beside a cup of tea that had already begun to cool. She unfolded the letter carefully, reading every line with complete attention before quietly closing her eyes for a brief moment. A smile slowly appeared across her face, brighter than Adrian had ever seen before. She whispered a soft prayer of gratitude that disappeared almost completely beneath the distant sound of the dishwasher. Adrian continued walking without interrupting, yet the image stayed with him long after he entered the library. The following morning, the estate buzzed with preparations for an important charity banquet. Caterers moved through the hallways carrying boxes of decorations while florists arranged white orchids throughout the ballroom. Grace coordinated quietly with every department, solving small problems before anyone else noticed them. Watching from across the room, Adrian realized she possessed remarkable organizational skills that extended far beyond ordinary household responsibilities. She anticipated schedules, remembered details, and calmly guided overwhelmed employees without seeking recognition. During the afternoon, one of the younger assistants accidentally misplaced an important guest seating chart. Panic spread quickly as several workers searched every table. Before frustration could grow, Grace quietly reached beneath a stack of linen samples and retrieved the missing document with a reassuring smile. Sometimes people look everywhere except the place where they last believed in themselves, she said gently. The assistant laughed with visible relief, unaware that Adrian had heard every word. Those simple sentences echoed in his thoughts long after the ballroom emptied. He no longer wondered whether Grace was hiding something shameful. Instead, he began wondering what kind of extraordinary life could teach someone such quiet wisdom while asking for so little in return, and he sensed that the answer was closer than he had ever imagined. The charity banquet ended well after sunset, leaving the mansion wrapped once again in quiet stillness. Crystal glasses had been cleared away, candles extinguished, and the last guests disappeared beyond the front gates beneath a sky filled with scattered stars. Adrian remained alone in his study, yet instead of reviewing financial reports, he found himself remembering Grace's smile as she read the university letter and the calm confidence with which she had guided an entire event without asking for recognition. Something no longer fit the story he had silently written about her. Early the next morning, while walking through the east corridor, Adrian noticed Grace carefully wiping dust from a collection of framed family portraits that had belonged to previous generations of the Moretti family. She handled every photograph with extraordinary care, pausing briefly whenever she straightened one that had shifted slightly out of place. Adrian stopped beside her. "You always spend extra time with the photographs," he observed. Grace smiled gently, without looking away from the frame she was adjusting. "Pictures remind people who they are when life becomes too busy to remember." Adrian studied her expression. It carried neither sadness nor regret, only quiet certainty. Before he could continue the conversation, another employee called Grace to assist with a delivery in the kitchen. She excused herself politely and disappeared down the hallway, leaving Adrian standing before portraits he had not truly looked at in years. That afternoon, the mansion received a shipment of office supplies for the household administration. While helping organize inventory, Grace noticed one of the newer employees struggling to complete several reimbursement forms. Instead of taking over, she patiently explained every section, using clear examples until the young woman understood the process herself. Adrian happened to pass the doorway and paused unnoticed. Grace never made the lesson feel like correction. She spoke with the gentle confidence of someone who had once been taught by people she deeply respected. Later, curiosity led Adrian to ask the house manager another simple question. Did Grace receive any special training before working here? The manager shook his head thoughtfully. Nothing listed in her employment file, sir. Although I have often wondered the same thing. She learns almost anything after seeing it once. The answer only deepened Adrian's questions. That evening, rain returned, falling softly against the mansion windows while Grace prepared to leave after another long shift. As she stepped into the foyer, she noticed an elderly florist struggling to carry several empty wooden crates toward his truck. Without hesitation, she walked outside into the cold drizzle and helped him load every box, refusing the small tip he offered afterward. Instead, she simply wished him a safe drive home before quietly returning inside to retrieve her canvas bag. Adrian had watched the entire exchange from the second-floor balcony. She had not realized anyone was looking. There had been no audience to impress, no reward to earn, only an instinctive act of kindness offered without expectation. When Grace finally left for the evening, Adrian walked slowly through the now empty foyer. Resting near the entrance bench, he noticed a folded notebook that had accidentally slipped from her canvas bag. He picked it up, intending only to return it the next morning. As he carefully lifted it from the polished floor, a small piece of paper drifted silently onto the marble beneath his feet. It was not money, nor a receipt, nor an ordinary note. It was a scholarship award letter bearing Ethan Coleman's name, and the signature at the bottom revealed that nearly every dollar of tuition had been paid through anonymous private donations arranged over several semesters. Adrian stared at the page in stunned silence, realizing the mystery surrounding Grace's life had just become far deeper than he had ever imagined. Adrian carried the notebook to his study with careful hands, placing it on the polished walnut desk as though it contained something far more valuable than paper. He had no intention of reading another person's private thoughts. The scholarship letter had slipped free by accident, and the notebook itself remained closed exactly as he had found it. Even so, one question refused to leave his mind. If Ethan Coleman's tuition had been covered by anonymous donations for several years, why was Grace still working long hours every day and accepting every extra shift she could find? The following morning, he returned the notebook before anyone else arrived. Grace had just finished arranging breakfast in the dining room when Adrian quietly approached. "I believe this belongs to you," he said, placing it gently on the side table. For the first time since she had begun working at the estate, Grace's calm expression briefly faltered. She looked down at the notebook, then back at Adrian with visible relief. "Thank you, Mr. Moretti," she said softly. "I thought I had lost it on the bus." Adrian simply nodded. He never mentioned the scholarship letter. Grace carefully slipped the notebook back into her canvas bag and continued preparing the room exactly as she always had. Yet something subtle had changed between them. The silence no longer felt distant. It felt respectful. Later that afternoon, Adrian found himself driving across town for a meeting near the university whose address he had seen on the envelope delivered a few days earlier. As he waited at a traffic light, he noticed a familiar figure stepping out of the campus library. Grace was standing beneath a row of maple trees whose golden leaves drifted slowly across the sidewalk. Beside her stood a young man wearing a backpack and carrying several thick textbooks against his chest. The resemblance between them was unmistakable. They shared the same warm smile and gentle eyes. The young man spoke excitedly while showing her a printed document. Grace listened with quiet pride before reaching up to straighten his jacket collar the way only an older sister could. When they embraced, it was filled not with celebration alone, but with relief, earned through years of sacrifice. Adrian remained where he was, unseen behind the windshield as the traffic light changed from red to green. He did not follow them. He simply watched as Grace handed the young man a paper lunch bag she had likely prepared before sunrise. Ethan laughed, thanked her, and hurried toward a classroom while Grace stood on the sidewalk until he disappeared inside the building. Only then did she quietly check the time and walk toward the nearest bus stop, choosing public transportation instead of spending money on a taxi. That evening, Adrian asked his financial advisor to quietly verify one detail without invading anyone's privacy. The answer arrived before sunset. Ethan Coleman had maintained outstanding academic performance every semester. The anonymous scholarship covered tuition alone. Housing, books, meals, transportation, and everyday living expenses remained the responsibility of the family. Adrian leaned back in his chair, understanding at last why Grace accepted every additional shift without complaint and why every paycheck mattered so much. She had never been working only for herself. Every polished floor, every carefully folded towel, every late evening and early morning had quietly become another step toward her younger brother's future. Standing beside the study window as the first snowflakes of the season drifted gently across the mansion gardens, Adrian realized the greatest strength inside his home had never belonged to wealth, influence, or power. It belonged to the woman everyone had overlooked because she never asked the world to notice her. The first snowfall settled quietly across the Moretti estate, covering stone pathways and garden hedges with a thin layer of white that softened even the sharpest corners of the sprawling property. Inside the mansion, fireplaces glowed warmly while the scent of cinnamon and fresh pine drifted through the hallways as the staff prepared seasonal decorations. Grace moved through the familiar routine with the same quiet dedication she had shown every day since arriving 2 years earlier, unaware that Adrian no longer saw her as simply another employee. He had stopped measuring people by the positions they held and had begun noticing the burdens they carried without complaint. One afternoon, Adrian asked the house manager to schedule a staff appreciation luncheon, something the estate had never formally organized before. The announcement surprised everyone. Long dining tables were arranged in the ballroom, replacing business meetings with homemade meals prepared by the kitchen staff themselves. For the first time, gardeners, housekeepers, drivers, cooks, and maintenance workers all sat together as equals beneath crystal chandeliers that usually overlooked formal receptions. Grace quietly chose a seat near the far end of the room, hoping to remain unnoticed as always. During the meal, Adrian stood to thank every employee for their dedication. Instead of delivering a polished speech, he spoke simply about loyalty, dignity, and the unseen effort that kept a household standing long after guests had gone home. Then he did something no one expected. He invited several department supervisors to share stories about coworkers whose kindness often went unnoticed. One by one, people began speaking. The head chef described arriving before dawn to discover fresh ingredients already organized because Grace had quietly stayed late the previous evening. The groundskeeper smiled as he recalled finding hot coffee waiting on freezing mornings with no note attached, though everyone eventually realized who had left it there. The elderly florist thanked the mysterious person who had helped him carry heavy crates through cold rain without accepting payment. The younger administrative assistant stood nervously before admitting that she had nearly resigned during her first month until Grace patiently taught her every task after work without ever asking for recognition. As each story unfolded, employees slowly turned toward Grace with growing surprise. Many had experienced her kindness personally, yet none had realized how many others had received the same quiet generosity. Grace lowered her eyes, clearly uncomfortable becoming the center of attention. Adrian noticed her embarrassment and gently redirected the conversation. Sometimes, he said, the strongest person in a room is the one who spends the least time trying to prove it. Silence settled over the ballroom before soft applause gradually filled the space. It was not loud or dramatic. It sounded sincere. Grace looked around the room, meeting faces that now carried gratitude instead of simple familiarity. After lunch ended, several employees approached her individually, thanking her for moments she barely remembered herself. One woman quietly admitted that Grace's encouragement had given her confidence to return to school at night. Another thanked her for visiting his wife in the hospital while he worked double shifts. Grace listened with gentle surprise, as though she had never considered those small acts worthy of remembrance. Standing near the ballroom entrance, Adrian realized that genuine respect could never be demanded through authority alone. It had to be earned through character. Watching Grace smile modestly while others celebrated the goodness she had quietly shared for years, he understood that the greatest influence inside his home had never come from the person who owned the mansion. It had come from the woman who had quietly filled it with compassion one ordinary day at a time. The days following the staff luncheon carried a different feeling through the Moretti estate. Nothing dramatic had changed on the surface. The marble floors still gleamed beneath the morning sunlight. Fireplaces still warmed the long hallways, and Grace continued arriving before dawn with her familiar canvas bag resting gently against her shoulder. Yet the way people greeted her had quietly transformed. Housekeepers who once hurried past now stopped to ask about her weekend. The gardeners saved a cup of hot coffee for her during cold mornings. Even the younger employees who had once been too shy to approach her now sought her advice with genuine confidence. Grace accepted every kind word with the same humble smile, never behaving as though she deserved special attention. Adrian watched these changes unfold without interfering. He understood that respect meant far more when it grew naturally rather than being ordered into existence. One snowy afternoon, while reviewing documents inside his study, Adrian received a call from the university financial aid office. Weeks earlier, after learning about Ethan's remarkable academic record, he had quietly instructed his charitable foundation to establish an expanded scholarship program for first-generation college students facing financial hardship. The foundation board approved the proposal without ever connecting it to Grace or her family. Adrian made only one request. Every scholarship would remain completely anonymous. No recipient would ever know where the support originated. The director of the foundation smiled during the phone call. The first award letters will be mailed tomorrow. Adrian thanked him and ended the conversation without another word. Across town, Grace was finishing another shift before catching the evening bus to visit Ethan at the university. Winter sunlight faded early, painting the campus in soft shades of blue and silver as students hurried between brick buildings carrying backpacks and steaming cups of coffee. Ethan greeted his sister outside the engineering department with the same joyful enthusiasm he had shown since childhood. They sat together on a wooden bench overlooking a frozen pond while he eagerly described a research project that had recently earned recognition from one of his professors. Grace listened with quiet pride, her tired eyes brightening every time her younger brother spoke about his future. Before they parted, Ethan reached into his backpack and handed her a sealed envelope. "Another scholarship notice arrived today," he said with disbelief. "They expanded my financial assistance again." They even included funding for books and housing next semester. Grace looked at the letter in stunned silence. She carefully read every page before lifting grateful eyes toward the winter sky. "Someone believes in your future," she whispered softly. Ethan smiled. "I hope I can thank them one day." Grace gently folded the letter and placed it inside the same notebook she had carried for years. "The best way to thank them," she replied, "is to become the kind of person who helps someone else someday." Unseen from across the quiet campus courtyard, Adrian stood beside his parked car after finishing a nearby business meeting. He had no intention of approaching them. He simply watched the conversation from a respectful distance before quietly driving away. The greatest gifts, he realized, were often the ones that never revealed the name of the giver. As fresh snow began falling across the campus, Grace and Ethan walked toward the library side by side, laughing together beneath a single umbrella. Adrian smiled faintly before turning onto the main road, unaware that the smallest act of silent generosity had already begun changing far more lives than he had ever expected. Spring arrived almost unnoticed, replacing the last traces of snow with fresh green leaves that shimmered beneath warm morning sunlight. The Moretti estate seemed brighter than it had in years, not because the marble floors shined more brilliantly or the gardens bloomed more beautifully, but because the people inside had quietly begun treating one another with a deeper sense of gratitude. Grace Coleman still arrived through the same service entrance carrying her familiar canvas bag, still greeted every employee with the same gentle smile, and still completed every task with quiet excellence. Yet something had changed within her as well. She no longer walked through the mansion believing she had to remain invisible. She understood that kindness had a way of revealing itself, even when no one intended to be seen. One pleasant Saturday afternoon, the Charitable Foundation organized its annual community gathering on the estate grounds. Families, students, teachers, volunteers, and scholarship recipients filled the gardens with laughter while children played beneath flowering trees. Grace attended only because several co-workers insisted she take the afternoon off and enjoy the celebration. Ethan arrived from the university carrying the confidence of someone whose future had become brighter through years of determination and quiet sacrifice. As the ceremony began, the foundation director stepped onto a small wooden stage overlooking the gardens. Instead of speaking about financial success, he spoke about ordinary people whose unseen acts of generosity changed lives every single day. Then he invited several scholarship recipients to share what education had meant to them. Ethan stood before the audience with calm gratitude shining in his eyes. He thanked his professors, his classmates, and above all, the older sister who had believed in his future long before anyone else had. Grace lowered her head modestly while soft applause drifted through the crowd. When Ethan finished speaking, the foundation director made one final announcement. Beginning that year, a new mentorship program would pair graduating scholarship recipients with younger students facing similar struggles, allowing kindness to continue from one generation to the next. Ethan immediately volunteered. Grace smiled through quiet tears, realizing the hope she had protected for so many years was now becoming someone else's beginning. Adrian watched from beneath the shade of an old oak tree, saying nothing. He never stepped onto the stage, never accepted recognition, and never revealed the quiet choices that had helped shape this moment. As guests slowly wandered through the gardens afterward, Grace noticed Adrian standing alone near the reflecting pond. She approached with the same respectful smile she had offered him every morning for 2 years. "It is a beautiful day," she said softly. Adrian nodded. "It is." After a brief silence, he added, "You once said that pictures remind people who they are." Grace smiled gently. "Yes." Adrian looked across the water where Ethan was laughing with younger students. "Today I think people reminded each other who they could become." Grace quietly followed his gaze. Neither of them mentioned scholarships, anonymous gifts, or the accidental moment months earlier when one wrong door had opened the path toward a very different understanding. Some truths no longer needed explanation. As the afternoon sun settled across the gardens, birds sang from the flowering branches, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh blossoms through the estate. Grace walked toward her brother with peaceful confidence while Adrian remained by the pond, watching another season begin. Power had built the mansion that stood behind them, but compassion had quietly turned it into a home, proving that the greatest lives are not remembered for the doors they own, but for the hearts they choose to open.